So last time we looked at some reasons for the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Before we get into another video, I wanted to kind of organize these points a bit. The two main arguments are NATO expansion versus Hitler narrative, maybe, or remake Soviet Union. And then intervention in Ukraine. So you have remake Soviet Union, right to security, you have NATO expansion, you have intervention in Ukraine. I mean, I suppose that really is more of the media censorship. Hitler narrative is more remake Soviet Union. Okay, that's something to start with.
You wrote the book, The Russo-Ukrainian War, The Return of History, that gives the full context leading up to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in February 2022. So can you take me through the key moments in history that led up to this war? So we'll mention the collapse of the Soviet Union. We could probably go much farther back, but the collapse of the Soviet Union, mentioned 2014. Maybe you can highlight key moments that led up to 2022.
The key moments would be first the year 2004, known for Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and then the year 2013, known as the Revolution of Dignity. Both were the revolts against something that by a significant part of Ukrainian population was considered to be completely unacceptable actions on the part of the government and people in the government at that time. So the Orange Revolution of 2004 was a protest against falsified presidential elections and rejection of a candidate that was supported by Russia, publicly supported by Russia. I remember being in Moscow at that time and couldn't believe my eyes when in the center of Russia I saw a billboard with Yanukovych. The trick was that there were a lot of Ukrainians in Russia and in Moscow in particular, and they had the right to vote. It led to the election of Ukrainian president Viktor Yushchenko, who put on the agenda the issue of Ukraine's membership in NATO. So it was very clear pro-Western orientation. And the second case was the Revolution of Dignity 2013, with some of the same characters, including Yanukovych, who at that time was already president of Ukraine, And there the question was of the government promising the people for 1 year at least to sign association agreement with European Union, and then turning over almost overnight and saying that they were not going to do that. And that's how things started. But then when they became really massive, and why something that was called revolution, Euro revolution, became revolution of dignity, was when the government police beat up students in downtown Kiev, who, judging by the reports, were basically already almost ready to disperse, almost ready to go home. And that's when roughly half of Kiev showed up on the streets. That sort of the police behavior, that sort of the was absolutely unacceptable in Ukraine. The stealing elections and falsification of elections was unacceptable. That's where around that time, and around 2004, the president of Ukraine at that time, Leonid Kuchma, writes a book called Ukraine is Not Russia. And apparently the term comes from his discussion with Putin, when Putin was suggesting to him quite strongly to use force against people on the Maidan, on the square in Kiev.
So this seems to be the strongest argument against what Jeffrey Sachs was saying, that actually Ukraine wanted to be neutral, and then 2014 there was a US intervention which leads to Yanukovych leaving, whereas what we're seeing here is that actually these two massive shifts towards the West, and that the only reason Yanukovych might have even gotten power was because of Russian influence. It's almost the exact opposite argument.
And Kuchma allegedly said him, you don't understand, Ukraine is not Russia. You can't do things like that. You get pushback, and that's this two events, 2004 and then 2013, became really crucial point in terms of the Ukraine direction, the survival of Ukrainian democracy, which is one of very few countries in the post-Soviet space where democracy survived the original flirt between the government leaders and democracy of the 1990s. It was the all-Soviet story. In Russia, everywhere else, there was high democratic expectations, but they came pretty much to an end by the end of the decade. Ukraine preserved the democracy. And the orientation of Ukraine toward integration in some form into Western and European structures, that Ukrainian democracy plus Western orientation was something. And in Russia, we see the strengthening of the autocratic regime under Vladimir Putin. That, if you look deeper, these are the processes that put the two countries on the collision course.
So there's a division, a push and pull inside Ukraine on identity, of whether they're part of Russia or part of Europe. And you highlighted two moments in Ukrainian history that there's a big flare-up where the statement was first, Ukraine is not Russia, and essentially Ukraine is part of Europe. But there's other moments.
Mm-hmm.
What were the defining moments that began an actual war in the Donbass?
The war started in February of 2014 with the Russian takeover of Crimea by military force, right? The so-called Green Man. And the big question is why. And it's very important to go.
So I guess one more note is the Ukrainian identity argument. Ukraine is not Russia. I suppose there's nothing super new in this point, but it will later relate to Putin's talk about how Ukraine and Russia are should be reunited, I suppose.
Go back to the year 2013 and the start of the protests and the story of the Ukraine signing association agreement with the European Union. So from what we understand today, the Ukrainian government under President Yanukovych did this suicidal sharp turn after 1 year of promise and association agreement saying that, okay, we changed our mind under pressure from Moscow. And Moscow applied that pressure for one reason, at least in my opinion. The Ukraine signing association agreement with the European Union would mean that Ukraine would not be able to sign association agreement with any Eurasian Union in any shape or form that was at that time in the process of making. And for Vladimir Putin, that was the beginning of his, or part of his third term. One of his agenda items for the third term was really consolidation of the post-Soviet space and Eurasian space. And not membership in NATO, not membership in European Union, but association agreement with European Union meant that that post-Soviet space would have to exist under Moscow's control, but without Ukraine, the second largest post-Soviet republic, the republic on whose vote depended the continuing existence of the Soviet Union and whose vote ended in many ways the existence of the Soviet Union. So that is broadly background, but also there are of course personalities, there are also their beliefs, their readings of history, and all of that became part of the story. But if you look at that geopolitically, the association agreement is putting Ukraine outside of the Russian sphere of influence. And the response was an attempt to topple the government in Kyiv that clearly was going to sign that agreement, to take over Crimea and to help to deal with a lot of issues within Russia itself and boost the popularity of the president, and it certainly worked in that way as well. And once Ukraine, still after Crimea, continued on its path, then the next step started the so-called hybrid warfare in Donbass. But again, the unlike Crimea, from what I understand, Russia was not really looking forward to taking possession of Donbass. Donbass was viewed as the way how to influence Ukraine, to stop it from a drift toward the west.
Maybe you can tell me about the region of Donbass.
I mentioned that.
So there seems to be these two narratives. So the narrative from Sachs is Yanukovych does this EU U-turn. There were then protests, but then why does that would be more consistent with? I guess it's the timing of Yanukovych is kicked out, and then that leads to Crimea. So they're kind of two consistent narratives about what happened, but one is arguing that Yanukovych getting kicked out was US influence, and the other is arguing that Yanukovych's U-turn was Russian influence. So that seems to be the key distinction. And then they both agree, obviously, that Crimea was taken. There's different arguments about whether Putin wants to build a Eurasian ambition versus stopping Europe, the expansion of NATO. I suppose it's interesting that he doesn't feel like Donbass was something that Russia wanted to take over, but more uses influence on Ukraine.
That nationalism and principle of nationalism is the principle of making the political borders to coincide with ethnic and cultural borders. And that's how the maps of many East European countries had been drawn in the 19th and 20th century. On that principle, Donbass, where the majority constituted by the beginning of the 20th century were Ukrainians, was considered to be Ukrainian and was claimed in the middle of this revolution and revolutionary wars and civil wars by Ukrainian government. But Donbass became a site, one of the key sites in the Russian Empire of early industrialization.
So I think the point here is that Donbass was a way for Russia to influence Ukraine. That's the key point there. And the reason for Crimea seizure was...
And with its mining industry, with its metallurgical industry. So what that meant was that people from other parts of, not Ukraine, but other parts of the Russian Empire congregated there. That's where jobs were. That's how Khrushchev and his family came to Donbass. The family of Brezhnev overshoot a little bit. They got to the industrial enterprises in the city of Kamensk near Dnipro, the city that was called Dnipropetrovsk. So those were Russian peasants moving into the area in looking for the job, and by the population became quite mixed. Ukrainians still constituted the majority of the population, but not necessarily in the towns and in the cities. And culturally, the place was becoming more and more Russian as the result of that moment. So, apart from the Crimea, Donbass was the part of Ukraine where the ethnic Russians were the biggest group. They were not the majority, but they were very, very big and significant group. For example, in the city of Mariupol, that was all but destroyed in the course of the last 2 years. The ethnic Russians constituted over 40% of the population, right? So that's not exactly part of Donbass, but that gives you general idea. Now, the story of Donbass and what happened now is multidimensional, and this ethnic composition is just one part of the story. Another very important part of the story is economy. And Donbass is a classical rust belt. And we know what happens with the cities that were part of the first or second wave of industrialization in the United States and globally. We know about social problems that exist in those places. So Donbass is probably the most dramatic and tragic case of implosion of the Rust Belt, with the mines not anymore producing the sort of and at the acceptable price the coal that they used to produce, with people losing jobs, with the politicians looking for subsidies as opposed to trying very unpopular measures of dealing something and bring new money and new investment into the region. So all of that become part of the story that made it easy for Russia, for the Russian Federation, to destabilize the situation. We have interviews with Mr. Girkin, who is saying that he was the first who pulled the trigger and fired the shot in that war. He became the Minister of Defense in the Donetsk People's Republic. You look at the Prime Minister; he is another person with a Moscow residency permit. So you see key figures in those positions at the start and the beginning, not being Russians from Ukraine, but being Russians from Russia and Russians from Moscow, closely connected to the government structure and the intelligence structure and so on. So that is the start and the beginning. But the way how it exploded, the way it did, was also a combination of the economic and ethnocultural and linguistic factors.
So for Putin, the war in Donbass and even in 2022 is a defensive war against what the Ukrainian government is doing against ethnically Russian people of Donbass. Is that fair to say? Well, how he describes it?
What we see, this is certainly the argument, right? This is certainly the argument, and a pretext, because what we see there is that there would be no, and there was no independent mobilization in Crimea either, in Crimea or in Donbass, without Russian presence. Without Russian occupation de facto of the Crimea, there would be no, and there was no before, at least in the previous 5 to 6 years, any mass mobilizations of Russians. There was none of such mobilizations in Donbass before Girkin and other people with military, with parts of military units showed up there. So it is an excuse. You've been to Ukraine. Mm-hmm. You know that Russian language is not persecuted in Ukraine. And if you've not been to Donbass, it would be or to the Crimea, it would be difficult to find one single Ukrainian school. Not that they didn't exist at all, but it would take quite an effort for you to find it. Or sometimes even to hear Ukrainian language outside either of the institutions or the...
So it seems like there's two arguments here. So one is Russia, Donbass is a way for Russia to influence Ukraine, but then also that there's conditions for exploitation, I suppose. Yeah, so I think this is the second. So there's conditions for Russian influence in the Donbass.
Or the farmers' market. So that's the reality. That's the reality that is clear, that is visible. So imagine under those conditions and context that someone is persecuting ethnic Russians or Russian speakers. One, to believe in something like that, one important precondition is never to step your foot in Ukraine.
I should mention, maybe this is a good moment to mention, when I traveled to Ukraine, this is after the start of the war, you mentioned farmers market, which is funny. Basically every single person I talked to including the leadership, we spoke in Russian. For many of them, Russian is the more comfortable language even. And the people who spoke Ukrainian are more on the western side of Ukraine, and young people that are kind of wanting to show that in an activist way that they want to fight for the independence of their country. So I take your point. I wonder if you want to comment about language and maybe about the future of language in Ukraine. Is the future of language going to stabilize on Ukrainian, or is it going to return to its traditional base of Russian language?
Very roughly, before the start of the war in 2014, we can talk about parity between Russian and Ukrainian, and also with, as you said, clearly Ukraine being a dominant language in the West and Russian being a dominant language on the streets, certainly in the east of the country. Then in between of that, to pause a number of these transitional areas. And Ukraine, in my experience, and I visited a lot of countries, not all of them, and probably maybe I will be still surprised, but in my experience, this is the only truly bilingual country that I ever visited. I lived in Canada for a long period of time. There is Quebec and the rest, and in Ukraine, you can talk in either Russian or Ukrainian in any part of the country, and you would be understood, and you would be responded in a different language with the expectation that you would understand. And if you don't understand, that means you don't come from Ukraine. That's the reality. The war and loss of the Crimea and partial loss of Donbass, if it's major in that.
So I think the key point with the conditions in the Donbass, so it's kind of Rust Belt argument. I suppose it's a similar argument to Trump's rise in America. But I suppose what he's arguing is that Putin's argument that there is discrimination against Russians isn't true.
Industrial areas really shifted the balance toward mostly Ukrainian-speaking regions. And also what you see, and you clearly pointed to that, starting with 2014, even a little bit earlier, the younger generation chooses Ukrainian as a marker of its identity. And that started in 2014, but we have a dramatic shift after 2022. And on the anecdotal level, I can tell you that I speak to people who be in Chernihiv at the time. This is east of Crimea at the time of the Russian aggression and bombardment and so on and so forth, who had passive knowledge of Ukrainian but spoke all their life Russian. And they would speak Ukrainian to me, and when I say, okay, why you're doing that? We know each other for decades, and you used Russian. And he said, well, I don't want to have anything in common with people who did that to us. So there is a big push, of course, with this current war. Now the question is whether this change is something that will stay or not. What is the future? Linguistic practices are very, very conservative ones. And we at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute have a project called MAPA, Digital Atlas of Ukraine, and we were documenting and mapping different data in time. And what we noticed, a spike in the people self-reporting of use of Ukrainian in 2014 and 2015 at the time of the start of the war, when the threat was the most clear one. This is self-reporting. That doesn't mean that people exactly do but they believe that that's what they are supposed to do. and then return back to where it was by the year 2016 and 2017. So this dynamic can repeat itself, but given the how long the war is going on, how big the impact is, how big the stress is, and that the wave of the future is probably associated with younger people who are switching to Ukrainian. So I would my bet would be on Ukrainian language rising in prominence.
So as we get closer to February of 2022, there's a few other key moments. Maybe let's talk about in July 2021, Putin publishing an essay titled "On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians." Can you describe the ideas expressed in this essay?
The idea is very conveniently presented already in the first paragraph, in the first sentences, really, of the article, where Putin says that for a long time I was saying that Russians and Ukrainians were one and the same people, and here is the proof. This is the historical. He develops his historical argumentation apparently with the help of a lot of people around him. And he started to talk about Russians and Ukrainians being one and the same people 1 year before the start of the war in 2014. So in 2013, he was together with Patriarch Kirill on visit to Kiev, and there was a conference specifically organized for him in the Kievan Caves monastery, and that's where he stated that. The fact that he was with Patriarch Kirill is very important factor for understanding where the idea is coming from. This is the idea that was dominant in the Russian Empire of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, that Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians are really Great Russians, Little Russians, and White Russians, and that they constitute one people. Yes, there are some dialectical differences. Yes, Ukrainians sing well. Yes, they dance funny, but overall, that doesn't matter. And that idea actually was really mostly destroyed by the revolution of 1917. Because it wasn't just social revolution. That's how it is understood in US and good part of the world. It was also national revolution. It was an empire. It was a revolution in the Russian Empire. And to bring these pieces of empire back within the Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks had to make concessions. And one of those concessions was to recognition of the existence of Ukrainians as a separate nation, Belarusians as separate nations, Russians as separate nations, endowing them with their own territorial, with borders, with institutions, and so on and so forth. But there was one institution that was not reformed. That institution was called the Russian Orthodox Church. Because one of the ways that Bolsheviks dealt with it, they couldn't eradicate religion completely, but they arrested the development of the religion and thinking and theology on the level as it existed before the revolution of 1917. So the Russian Orthodox Church of 1917 continued to be the Russian Orthodox Church in 1991 and in 2013, continuing the same imperial mantra of the existence of one big Russian nation, one unified people. And when you see the formation of the ideas about nations, about foreign policy in the Russian Empire after 1991, they're going back to the pre-Bolshevik times. Ukrainians do that as well. Estonians do that as well. The difference is that when Ukrainians go back, they go back to the pre-1917, their intellectual fathers and writings of basically liberal nationalism, or sometimes they go to the radical nationalism of Bandera, which would be not pre.
So this point is interesting to me because I think one of the strongest arguments I've heard for the fact that Putin is trying to rebuild a greater Russia or a Soviet Union, a Russian Empire, is the fact that he released this essay, and therefore it's all just part of this rebuilding, and it's the narrative that Hitler will take Poland and he will keep going and going unless you stop him. What's interesting though is the framing here is that actually the Soviet Union gave greater national identity to Belarusians and Ukrainians, and that's a national revolution, not just a social one, and that actually Putin has to go historically back to pre-Soviet Union. Now, I suppose the argument is if the Soviet Union has a downfall, then maybe you can legitimately argue that we should move back to the way things were before the Soviet Union, which would be the imperial times. I think there's also a broader idea emerging, which is there's a Russian perspective, which has its own national security, and then a US perspective. And those two perspectives can compete against one another, either in terms of NATO expansion, threat of nuclear war, taking of Crimea, taking of Donbass, invading Ukraine, and that the Ukrainian perspective almost doesn't matter within that power game between those two actors. Both sides try and get legitimacy about their actions based upon what Ukrainians are doing, and then in particular there's an argument that if someone gets elected who's pro-Russian, that was an illegitimate election. If they are moved to neutral, that was US intervention. But in some ways, the Ukrainian perspective doesn't matter. I think Sachs would argue that even if Ukrainians wanted to join NATO, US should be smart politically and not allow them.
1917, but pre-1945. When the Russians go to pre-Bolshevik past, looking for the ideas, looking for inspiration, looking for the narratives, what they find there is empire. What they find there are imperial projects. And that's certainly the story of the Putin's claim. That's the story of the argument. And to conclude, the argument that he lays out there, historical argument, comes also almost directly from the narratives of the late 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. So it's not only the argument is coming from that era, but also the argumentation is coming from that era as well.
But those arguments are all in the flavor of empire.
It's empire on the one hand, but also there is imperial understanding of what Russian nation is. That doesn't allow for independence of its Little Russian and White Russian branches, alleged branches, right? So what you see with the concept of the big Russian nation, that's late 19th, beginning 20th century. Empire sees the writing on the wall, that nationalism is on the rise, and it tries to survive by mobilizing the nationalism of the largest group in the empire, which happens to be Russian. Stalin is a big promoter of some form of Russian nationalism, especially during the war and after war. And he started his career as a very promising Georgian writer, writing in Georgian.
Yeah.
So he's not doing that for some personal affinity or cultural intellectual roots within Russian nation or Russian people. He is doing that for the sake of the success of his Soviet and communist project, and he has to get the largest ethnic group on board, which are Russians. But Stalin and Putin have different understanding who Russians are. Stalin already accepted Ukrainians and Belarusians. their existence. Putin goes back to pre-Stalin and pre-Lenin times.
So if we step back from the historical context of this and maybe the geopolitical purpose of writing such an essay, and forget about the essay altogether. I have family in Ukraine and Russia. I know a lot of people in Ukraine and Russia. Forget the war, forget all of this. There's a kind of, they all kind of sound the same. Like if I go to France, they sound different than in Ukraine and Russia. Like if you lay out the cultural map of the world, there's just a different beat and music and flavor to a people. I guess what I'm trying to say is there seems to be a closeness between the cultures of Ukraine and Russia. Like, how do we describe that? Do we acknowledge that? And how does that add tension with the national independence?
First of all, especially when it comes to Eastern Ukraine or to big cities, many people in Ukraine spoke Russian, right? Mm-hmm. Generally, it's the same language. On the top of that, we started our discussion with talking about the Slavs, right? So both Ukrainian and Russian language are Slavic languages. So there is proximity there as well. On the top of that, there is a history of existence in the Soviet Union and before that in one empire for a long period of time. So you see a lot of before the war, a lot of Ukrainian singers and entertainers performing in Russia and vice versa. And biography of President Zelensky is certainly one of the fits that particular model as well. That all talks about similarities, but these similarities also very often obscure things that became so important in the course of this war. And I already mentioned the book titled by President Kuchma of Ukraine, "Ukraine is not Russia." So that's the argument. Despite the fact that you think that we are the same, we behave differently. And it turned out that they behave differently. You have Bolotnaya in Moscow and police violence, and that's the end of it. You have the Maidan in Ukraine, and you have police violence, and that's the beginning. That's not the end. History really matters in the way why sometimes people speaking the same language with different accents behave very differently. Russia and Russian identity.
I feel like I don't know what the correct justification for a nation to exist is. But intuitively, just because two nations have similar cultures, it doesn't feel like, oh, that should then legitimize invasion or unification of the country. I suppose I'd stick with a simple democratic argument. If the people want to combine into a country, then they can. But this dance around we're similar culturally but also fundamentally different culturally doesn't seem that relevant. Even if the culture was exactly the same, you could still argue that they should be two separate nations.
Was formed around the state and has difficulty imagining itself outside of the state. And that state happened to be imperial for most of Russian history. Mm-hmm. Ukrainian project came into existence in revolt against the state. Ukraine came into existence out of the parts of different empires, which means they left different cultural impact on them. And for Ukrainians to stay together, autocratic regime so far didn't work. It's like the colonies of the United States. You have to find common language. You have to talk to each other. And that became part of the Ukrainian political DNA. And that became a huge factor in the war. And very few people in Ukraine believed what Vladimir Putin was saying, that Russians and Ukrainians were one and the same people. But the majority believed that they're certainly close culturally and historically nations. And from that point of view, the bombardment of the Ukrainian cities became such a shock to the Ukrainians. Because deep down, they maybe looked at Syria, they looked at Chechnya, and were explaining that through the fact that there was basically such a big cultural gap and difference between Russians and those countries and those nations. But my understanding, at least, most of them had difficulty imagining the war of that proportion and that sort of ferocity and that sort of war crimes, bringing that sort of war crimes and on that level.
So it's interesting that you say that in the DNA of Ukraine versus Russia. So maybe Russia is more conducive to authoritarian regimes, and Ukraine is more conducive to defining itself by rebelling against authoritarian regimes.
By rebellion, absolutely. And that was the story pretty much before 1991. So what you see since 1991 and what you see today is, I would say, new factor, certainly in Ukrainian modern history. Because Ukrainians traditionally were very successful rebels. The largest peasant army in the civil war in the Russian Empire was the Makhno army in southern Ukraine. And one revolt, Cossack revolts and other revolts, one after another. But Ukrainians had historically difficulty actually maintaining the sort of freedom that they acquired, had difficulty associating themselves with the state. And what we see, especially in the last 2 years, it's a quite phenomenal development in Ukraine when Ukrainians associate themselves with the state, where Ukrainians see a state not just as a foreigner, as historically it was in Ukrainian history, not just someone who came to take, but the state that is continuation of them, that helps to provide security for them, that the Ukrainian armed forces, even before the start of this war, had the highest support and popularity in Ukraine. The state today functions unbelievably effectively under attacks and missile attacks, and again, city government and local government. And we are witnessing, when it comes to Ukraine, we are witnessing a very important historical development where Ukrainians found their state for the first time through most of their history, and try to make a transition from successful rebels to successful managers and state builders.
Yeah. I talked to John Mearsheimer recently. There's a lot of people that believe NATO had a big contribution to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So what role did NATO play in this full history from Bucharest in 2008 to today?
NATO was a big part, certainly, of the Russian justification for the war. That was the theme that was up there in the months leading to the aggression. The truth is that, and Vladimir Putin went on record saying that the Western leaders were telling him again and again that there is no chance for Ukraine to become a member of NATO anytime soon. Russia was very effective back in the year 2008 in stopping Ukraine and Georgia on the path of joining NATO. There was a Bucharest summit at which the US president at that time, George W. Bush, was pushing for the membership. And Putin convinced leaders of France and Germany to block that membership. And after that, membership for Ukraine and for Georgia was really removed from the realistic agenda for NATO, and that's what the leaders of the Western world in the month leading to the February 2022 aggression were trying to convey to Vladimir Putin. What he wanted there was an ultimatum that really was there to not to start negotiations, but really to stop negotiations. He demanded the withdrawal of NATO to the borders of the 1997, if I'm not mistaken. So completely something that neither leaders would accept nor the countries members of NATO would.
So it's interesting, there's an alternative narrative so that NATO is an excuse. Actually, so it's a multi-pronged argument. So the first argument is that Russia was able to prevent Ukraine joining NATO. So that's, they're not powerless, they do have influence, I suppose, is the argument. Then the second part of that argument is they've already proven their influence. So NATO listens to Russia, and then Russia has this ultimatum to move back to 1997 borders, which is unacceptable. So it's a Russian ultimatum on NATO's borders. So I think his argument is, hey, look, NATO have listened to you. Trust them. And then this is the core of his argument, which is that Russia's true motives are around
accept. But for me, it's very clear that that was an excuse, that was a justification. And what happened later in the year 2022 and 2023 certainly confirms me in that belief. Finland joined NATO, and Sweden is on the way to joining NATO. So Finland joining NATO increased border between Russia and NATO twofold and probably more than that. So if NATO is the real concern, it would be probably not completely unreasonable to expect that if not every single soldier, but at least half of the Russian army fighting in Ukraine would be moved to protect the new border with NATO in Finland. So I have no doubt that no one in Kremlin, either in the past or today, looks favorably or is excited about NATO NATO moving, or the countries of Eastern Europe joining NATO. But I have very difficult time imagining that was the primary cause of the.
So NATO's expansion was used as justification for what was not the root cause, subsequent expansion. But I guess the core of his argument is that they didn't move troops there in the middle of the Ukraine war. If Russia was really concerned, they would have moved half of the troops from Ukraine to the border. This to me feels like a weaker argument, because it's not so much that if a country is part of NATO, they might immediately invade. I think the argument is more the US is going to have missiles in those countries, which then can threaten Russia. So it's not an immediate escalation, it's a later escalation. I suppose the question is, why have they focused on Ukraine above other countries in the region? Well, Belarus is already aligned with Russia, and Ukraine has a large border. Maybe both things can be true, that he's focused more on Ukraine than, say, other countries with borders with Russia because of this cultural similarity that, say, the Finns or the Swedes don't have with Russia.
The war. And what we see also, we talked about Tucker's interview. He was surprised, but he believed that Putin was completely honest when the first 25 minutes of interview he was talking about relations between Russia and Ukraine, was talking about history. And that was also the main focus of his essay. Essay was not on NATO and Russia. Essay was on Russia and Ukraine. So that is where the real causes are. The broader context is the fall of empire and process of disintegration of empire, not the story of NATO.
What was, to clarify, the reason Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022?
The immediate goal in 2014, when the war started, was to stop the drift of Ukraine toward the west and outside of the Russian sphere of influence. The invasion of 2022 perceived the same goals, keeping Ukraine in the Russian sphere of influence. Once we have the resistance, quite effective resistance on the part of Ukraine, the Rammstein and coalition, international coalition in support of Ukraine, then we see the realization of Plan B, where parts of Ukrainian territory are being annexed and included in the constitution of the Russian Federation. So the two scenarios don't exclude each other, but if scenario number one doesn't work, then scenario number two goes into play.
In the Gates of Kiev chapter, you write about Volodymyr Zelensky in the early days of the war. What are most important moments to you about that?
I mean, if you assume Putin is a rational actor, it's hard to understand how invading Ukraine brings Ukraine more into Russian influence. His actions seem to make more sense if you're trying to threaten NATO, I think.
This time, the first hours and days of the invasion.
The first hours and the first days were the most difficult psychologically. The rest of the world really didn't expect Kiev to last for more than a few days, didn't expect Ukraine to last for more than a few weeks. And all the data suggested that that's what would happen. Ukraine would collapse, would be taken over. Putin called his war a special military operation, which suggests also expectations about the scope, expectations about the time. So semi-military, semi-police operation. So every reasonable person in the world believed that would happen. And it's the heroism of quote-unquote unreasonable people, like Zelensky, like the commander of Ukrainian armed forces Zaluzhny, like mayors of the cities, Klitschko and others. I'm just naming names that are familiar to almost all of us now. But there are thousands of those people, unreasonable people, who decided that it was unreasonable to attack their country. And that was the most difficult times and days. And speaking about Zelensky, every, I understand, reasonable leader in the West was trying to convince him to leave Ukraine and to set a government in exile in Poland or in London. And it was reasonable to accept his one of his predecessors, Mr. Yanukovych, fled Kiev. A few months before that, in Afghanistan, the president of Afghanistan fled Afghanistan. That was a reasonable thing to expect. And he turned out to be very, very unreasonable in that sense. That comes with the guts, his guts and guts people around him and Ukrainians in general.
Why do you think he stayed in Kiev? This former comedian who played a president on TV when Kiev is being invaded by the second most powerful military in the world.
Because I think he believes in things. And one of those things was that if he...
So this is actually an important counter-narrative. So the narrative from Sachs is Zelensky sues for peace after 5 days. Boris Johnson talks him out of it. Whereas the argument here is that Zelensky, despite being told to flee, stays in bravery.
President, and he is in the presidential office. He is there to play his role to the end. And another thing, my personal, again, I never met Volodymyr Zelensky. My personal understanding of him is that he has talent that helped him in his career before the presidency and then helps now. He feels the audience and then channels the attitude of the audience and amplifies it. And I think that another reason why he didn't leave Kyiv was that he felt the audience. The audience in that particular context were the Ukrainians.
So he had a sense that the Ukrainians would unify, because he was quite, if you look at the polls before the war, quite unpopular. And there was still divisions and factions, and the government is divided. I mean, there's the East and the West and all this kind of stuff. You think he had a sense that this could unite people?
The East and the West was not already such an issue after Crimea and part of Donbass being gone. So Ukraine was much more united than it was before. He brought to power his, before that, really non-existent party of regions on his personal popularity, but the important thing is that he created a majority in the parliament which really reflected the unity that existed among Ukrainians that was not there before. He won with 73% of the population of those who took part in the elections. His predecessor, Petro Poroshenko, also carried 90% of the precincts, and the same happened with Zelensky. So the country unified after 2014 to a degree it was impossible to imagine before, and Zelensky felt that. Zelensky knew that. And that's where the talent of politician really matters, and that's something that you can see beyond just data, and you can feel that. Apparently, Yeltsin had that ability.
Why did the peace talks fail? There was a lot of peace talks.
Well, the main reason is that the conditions that Russia was trying to impose on Ukraine were basically unacceptable for Ukraine. Because one of the conditions, apart from this strange thing called denazification, was, of course, de facto loss of the territory, and for the future, really staying outside either of NATO or any Western support, which was very clear. You can buy a couple of weeks, you can buy a couple of months, but in the conditions like that, Russia will come back tomorrow and will take over everything. And once Ukrainians realize that they can win on the battlefield, once the Russians were defeated and withdrew from Kiev, the opportunity emerged to get out of the negotiations, which was very clear were leading, if not today, then tomorrow, to the complete destruction of Ukraine. And then, of course, once the territory started to be liberated, things like Bucha and massacres of the civilian population came to the fore, which made also quite difficult, if not impossible, to conduct negotiations from this moral and emotional point of view.
What about the claims that, Boris Johnson, the West, compromised the ability of these peace talks to be successful? Basically, kind of manipulated the talks.
I asked people who accompanied Boris Johnson to Kiev that question. The answer was no, and I believe this answer, and I'll tell you why. Because it is very difficult for me to imagine President Zelensky to take orders from anybody in the world, either Boris Johnson or Joe Biden or anybody else, and basically doing things that Zelensky believes are not in his interest or in the interest of his country. I just can't imagine that anybody in the world telling Zelensky what to do and Zelensky actually following it against his own wishes.
This seems like a weak argument, because surely Zelensky recognizes that he needs Western weapons to win, or at least not lose.
And desires, at least if that is possible, what is in the public sphere doesn't allow us to suggest that it is.
That said, Zelensky is a smart man, and he knows that the war can only continue with the West's support.
That is a different supposition to know that it can continue with the West's support, but if we are talking about withdrawing from the negotiations, that's not about the continuation of the war. For that you don't need Western support.
Well, what I mean is,
so his argument is Boris Johnson, no influence on peace talks because Zelensky acts independently. This feels very weak.
if he started to sense that the West will support no matter what, then maybe the space of decisions you're making is different.
We can interpret that way. But Boris Johnson represented, at that point, Britain, not the United States. And really what the war showed, and it was clear already at that time, that what was needed was massive support from the West as a whole. And the promise of that support came only after the West realized that Ukraine can win, and came only in late April with the Ramstein so at least a few weeks later. So I don't know.
So this is the stronger argument. Which is Zelensky terminated peace talks before Western support was assured, and that support only increased in April after initial Ukrainian successes. So I think the timing here really matters.
Know how much Boris Johnson could promise. He probably could promise to try to help and try to convince and try to work on that. If Zelensky acted on that promise, he certainly was taking a risk. But the key issue, again, I'm going back where I started, it's a principle, an acceptance for Ukraine, the conditions that were offered. And Ukraine was, the moment they saw the possibility that they could fight back, with Johnson's support, without Johnson's support, they took the chance.
So what are the ways this war can end, do you think? What are the different possible trajectories? Whether it's peace talks, what does winning look like for either side? What is the role of U.S.? What trajectories do you see that are possible?
It's a question on the one level very easy to answer, on the other very difficult. The level on which it is very easy, it's a broad historical perspective. If you really believe, and I believe in that this is the war of the Soviet succession, that this is the war of the disintegration of empire, you know how the story ends. And they end with disintegration of empire. They end with the rise of the new states and the appearance of the new colored spots on the map. That's the story that started with the American Revolution. So that's long-term perspective. The difficult part is, of course, what will happen tomorrow. The difficult part is what they will be in 2 days or even in 2 years. And in very broad terms, the war can end in one of 3 scenarios: the victory of one side, the victory of another side, and a sort of a stalemate and compromise, especially when it comes to the territories. This war is already approaching the end of the second year. I follow the news and look analysis. I don't remember one single piece suggesting that the next year will bring peace, or will bring peace for sure. And we are in a situation where both sides still believe that they can achieve something or improve their position on the battlefield. Certainly, that was the expectations of Ukrainian side back in the summer and early fall of 2023. And from what I understand now, this is certainly the expectations of the Russian side today. This is the largest war in Europe since World War II, the largest war in the world since Korean War. And we know that the Korean War ended in this division of Korea, but the negotiations were going on for more than 2 years. While those negotiations were going on, both sides were trying to improve their position there. And until there was a political change, death of Stalin, arrival of Eisenhower in the United States, and the realization that the chances of succeeding on the battlefield are huge, the peace talks didn't come. So at this point, all 3 scenarios are possible. I don't really discount any of them. It's early to say what will happen.
So without any political change, let's try to imagine what are the possibilities that the war ends this year? Is it possible that it can end with compromise basically at the place it started?
Meaning back to the borders of 2022?
Yeah, back to the borders of 22 with some security guarantees that aren't really guarantees but are hopeful guarantees.
No, it is not just virtual impossibility. It is impossible without political change in Moscow. The reason is that back in the fall of 2022, Vladimir Putin included 5 of Ukrainian regions, oblasts, even those that he didn't control fully, into the Russian constitution, which basically, in simple language, is that the hands are tied up not only for Putin himself, but also for his possible successors. So that means that no return to the borders of 2022 without political change in Moscow are possible. A few days after that decision in Moscow, Zelensky issued a decree saying that no negotiations with Russia. What that really meant in plain language is that basically we are not prepared to negotiate a stable agreement with 5 of our oblasts, not just annexed, but also included into the Russian constitution. So that's where we are. So that scenario is again, everything is possible, of course, but it's highly unlikely.
So the Russian constitution is a thing that makes this all very difficult.
Yes, and not only as a negotiation tactic for Putin or whoever would negotiate on the Russian side, but also as a legal issue.
So like the practical aspect of it even is difficult.
Yes, you really have to change the constitution before the peace agreement takes hold or immediately after that. And with the Minsk agreements, that was one of the things that Russia wanted from Ukraine, change of the constitution. And it turned out to be really impossible. So that's one of the backstories of the Minsk and collapse of the Minsk agreements.
Is there something like Minsk agreements that are possible now to, maybe this is a legal question, but to override the constitution, to sort of shake everything up? So see the constitutional amendment as just a negotiation tactic to come to the table to something like Minsk agreement.
Given how fast those amendments to the constitution were adopted, that suggests that really executive power in Russia has enormous power over the legislative branch. Mm-hmm. So it's again difficult to imagine, but technically this is possible again, possible if there is a political change in Moscow.
I don't understand why, assuming political change in Moscow is not possible this year. So I'm trying to see if there's a way to end this war this year, right?
There is a possibility of armistice, right? But armistice more along the, like any armistice, along the lines of the current front lines. But withdrawal of the Russian troops to the borders of 2022 at this point, whether it's reasonable or unreasonable, can be achieved only as the result of the defeat of the Russian army, like it happened near Kiev. Is it possible? Possible. Is it likely, especially given what is happening with the Western support, military support for Ukraine? Probably not.
But if Putin, the executive branch, has a lot of power, why can't the United States president, the Russian president, the Ukrainian president come to the table and draw up something like the Minsk agreements, and then rapid constitutional changes made, and you go back to the borders of 2022, before 2022, like through agreements, through compromise? Impossible for you?
Certainly not this year. I look at this year as the time when at least one side, Russian side, will try to get as much as it can through military means.
But that's been happening last year too. There's been a counteroffensive. There's been attempts. There's been.
It doesn't mean that that new year somehow is supposed to bring new tactics. The last year was pretty much a lot of fighting, a lot of suffering, very little movement of the front line. The biggest change of the last year was Ukraine victory on the Black Sea, where they pushed the Russian Navy into the western part of the pond and restored the grain corridor and export from Odessa, apparently up to 75% of what it used to be before the war. So that's the only major change. But again, the price is enormous in terms of wealth, in terms of, especially in terms of lives.
So thinking about what 2024 brings, Zelensky just fired Ukraine's head of the army.
So you've got these two narratives. It's Putin's imperial ambitions. It helps him domestically. And there's a Hitler narrative. But it's really the imperial narrative. There are some key events in Ukraine in terms of these two revolutions, and to what extent there's been Russian or US or British, I suppose, in the case of Boris Johnson, intervention. And then there's this central issue of NATO expansion. So what I think I want to be able to do is to go through each of these points and fact check them a little bit. But maybe we can do that in a separate